So hi everyone, and welcome to the fifth in our series of Big Think webinars for international school leaders, school owners and school groups. We're delighted you've joined us in what we hope will be a useful, inspiring and informative session that's all about thinking big about the future of international education. I'm Susie Williams of the International Schools team at Pearson. I'm delighted to be joined by three expert panellists for today's discussion, who you'll see on your screens here and who I'll introduce you to shortly. Before we get started, however, I'd like to draw your attention to the chat. Most of you have found it already, and the Q&A boxes. If you've got any technical queries as we go along, please do pop those into the chat and we'll aim to resolve them for you. And then please use the Q&A box to submit any questions you have on today's topic. I know some of you have submitted questions in advance, so thanks for those. There will be time at the end of the webinar for discussion, and we'll aim to get through as many of those as we can. Now, to help us understand a little bit more about all of you here today, we've got a quick opening poll which will be appearing on your screens now. And in it, I'd like you to please tell us what sort of international school you're representing here today and what your role is. I'll just give you 30 seconds or so, those of you who are here, to complete that poll, and then we'll have a little look at the results. Okay, thank you. So 50% of you, it looks like from the results I can see, excuse me, are joining us from an international school offering a British curriculum, and 20% offering an IB curriculum, and then 10% of you are joining from an international school offering a mix of British, IB and or US, some school owners and some others. I'm always intrigued about the others. And 35% of you are principals or head of schools, and then vice principals and members of the senior leadership, representing a further 15%. Thank you very much. That's really useful. So on to today's discussion. It's no exaggeration to say that the global pandemic has turned the exam series for international GCSEs and international A-levels on its head this year and last year. Brexit has continued to create anxiety about onward progression to universities in the UK, and perceived red tape around international students entering British universities has dented some parents' confidence in the value of British qualifications. So despite a British curriculum still being chosen by more schools than any other international curricula, the reputation of Brand Britain, and by association an international curriculum based on British qualifications, has been impacted. So do we need to restore confidence in the British education system? And if so, how do we help you as senior leaders restore your parents and your families' faith that yes, a British curriculum is still best? Before we answer that question, I think it's important to be clear about what this session isn't. So although the title is a British curriculum still best, that is slightly tongue-in-cheek, and we are very definitely not going to be bashing other international curricula here today. At Pearson, we work closely with many schools who follow a dual track curriculum approach. Indeed, some of you here, as the poll shows, will offer international GCSEs followed by the IB diploma programme. Others will offer British international academic and vocational qualifications alongside IB, and others still will be IB only schools. At last week's COBIS conference, there was a fascinating discussion with a school in the Middle East who have limited their GCSE students to taking just 5 international GCSEs, and they're supplementing that academic programme with a 2-year leadership programme and their own internship programme. So in short, we know that you, as international school leaders, are delivering the international curriculum programmes that best suit your students and their families to equip learners with the qualifications and the transferable skills they need to progress into successful global careers. We also won't be talking about the assessment arrangements for the current May-June exam series. I know many of you here will be knee-deep in that process now, and so thank you for joining us at what I know is a hugely busy time for you all. We all know that COVID has had a huge and lasting impact on students, and we do hope we can return to business as normal from the autumn term. But so what this session is an opportunity to remind us that after all the uncertainty and upheaval caused by COVID for yourselves, your teachers, your students and your parent community, how valuable a British curriculum is in terms of progression, how its international qualifications help your learners develop the skills and knowledge they need to take their next steps, and why it's the most in-demand sector within the international schools market. Now, on that note, of course, we know that COVID has had a huge impact on the international school sector over the last 15 months. And this is backed up by data for the period from ISC Research. In the sector as a whole, there were fewer school openings than were originally planned for September 2020. Some were delayed by a year, others for longer. And fee income growth has been impacted by struggling high fee schools and the rise in demand for middle market schools. Yet against this global backdrop, as I hope you can see on this slide, demand for British international schools remains strong. Growth in 2020 to 21 in British oriented schools is up 6.4% compared to 0.2% for all international schools. Staff numbers have grown by 9.1% overall, and growth in the British international school sector is much higher than the 2.3% of the growth in the overall market. It's clear from these stats that demand for a British curriculum remains buoyant despite the pandemic. So the market is confident in a British curriculum, but I'd like you to let me know in the poll that will appear on your screens now how confident you feel in the British curriculum pathway for your students. And if you can, please tell me the biggest factor influencing your confidence levels. And I will give you a little longer than 30 seconds on this poll, just because there's a lot of words on it. So if you can, please, in the next 45 seconds to 60 seconds, give me an idea of your confidence levels in the British curriculum and what the biggest factor influencing that. Okay, so 41% of you are saying you're still mostly confident that a British curriculum pathway is best, followed by 38% saying still very confident. So overall, 79% of you are mostly or very confident. 19% are less confident than you were, and 3% are no longer confident. Okay, brilliant. And the factors that are influencing those confidence levels. 32%, so quite ahead of the other factors here, are the broad and balanced education that it offers. Let's have a look next. So 22%, so the next factor that's influencing confidence is worldwide reputation for quality. And then we go down to 14% of you, opportunities it offers for progression to universities worldwide. 8% are saying the greatest factor that's influenced your confidence is the arrangements due to the assessment arrangements due to the pandemic in 2021 and 2020. 8% are indicating Brexit as a factor, and a further 8% parental support for a British curriculum pathway. That's hugely useful. Thank you very much, everybody. Now, without further ado, I'm delighted to introduce our panelists for today's webinar, who've been waiting very patiently at the top of the screen. Dr. Fiona Rogers, David Hawkins, and Nicola Merchant. Dr. Fiona Rogers is Deputy CEO and Director of Professional Development and Research at the Council of British International Schools. As I'm sure many of you will know, COBIS represents nearly 300 high-quality British international schools in 80 countries worldwide, supporting and representing their schools and corporate members with quality assurance, training, consultancy, and a host of other hugely valuable services. David Hawkins is Director and founder of the University Guys and is one of a small number of independent counsellors to hold the gold standard international affiliation with the Council of International Schools. As Director of the University Guys, he and his team provide bespoke individual and accredited advice to families pursuing global university options. Last year, the University Guys supported students who gained offers from 133 universities in 13 countries, including institutions such as Stanford, Princeton, Yale, Oxford, and Cambridge. David holds memberships in the International Association of College Admissions Counselling, the Independent Education Consultants Association, the Higher Education Consultants Association, and if that wasn't enough, he also serves on the Global Committee for IECA. And last but very much not least, Nicola Merchant is Director of International Qualifications at Pearson. As well as having direct oversight of Pearson's international academic qualifications, so international GCSEs and international A-levels, Nicola collaborates closely with colleagues to bring together a coherent approach to Pearson's 5 to 19 journey for all learners and teachers. And prior to joining Pearson, Nicola spent 20 years in the international private education sector and has worked with education franchisees around the globe, providing consultation, guidance and training on the implementation of brands, products and services. Welcome, Fiona, David and Nicola. Let's get started, shall we? I was hoping some of you would have said yes then. Great.
Yes.
Good.
Absolutely.
Not just me then. Right, so Fiona, let's kick off with a little more detail around the global demand for British education. We know that demand for British international schools is growing steadily despite the challenges of COVID. Can you tell us a bit more about this from your perspective at COBIS?
Sure, thanks, Susie. I mean, you've already shared some of those stats from ISC Research about the continued growth of the sector. And actually at our annual conference last week, ISC Research shared that same slide. And you can see from that there has been an increase of more than 500 new UK-oriented international schools since January 2020. And that demand is driven by various factors. So as you've alluded to already, that sort of demand for mid-priced schools, for more bilingual provision, but also a demand for recognised school brands and for English medium provision more generally. So, providing those pathways to higher education and recognised qualifications. And yes, of course, the rate of increase in enrolment may have slowed down a bit in some regions, but actually in others it's holding really steady. Again, you see in China, there's been a 14% increase in enrolment in 2020-21, and it's increasing in some regions. So India, for example, has seen a 17% enrolment growth this academic year. And I guess from a COBIS standpoint, well, the past 18 months have clearly been difficult for a lot of schools. That demand for British international schools does seem to be continuing to grow. In some cases, some of our schools have actually experienced an increase in students where maybe families have seen the way in which the sector's responded to the pandemic and remote learning and taken the decision to move their children into the sector from other systems. Or maybe families who would previously have sent their children to a boarding school in the UK who've chosen to keep them home in the home country, but remaining within the British system. And as a membership association, we continue to see a really healthy pipeline of schools applying to become COBIS schools. And that's established schools, but also schools that are applying through the provisional schools route. And that's really aimed at those UK independent schools opening branches abroad. So from our standpoint, yes, we really do still see a growing demand for the British international schools sector.
Well, that's really encouraging. Thank you. You mentioned that some parents are looking at the way that British international schools have responded in the pandemic. But what is it about a British curriculum beside that and the qualifications that appeals to parents and students worldwide, do you think?
Well, I think there's lots of factors at play. I mean, at its most basic, it's the fact that it's an English medium education. And that's something families want for their children. A lot of families want their children to be educated in English to give them the widest possible opportunities. But it's also things like the breadth of the curriculum coupled with an emphasis on really excellent pastoral care and extracurricular opportunities. As you've alluded to, recognised qualifications, clear progression routes to higher education in the UK, as well as other English medium universities, whether that's in the States or Canada, but also an easier transition between schools. And I think for globally mobile families, that's really important. So if you need to do year 4 in Muscat and then year 5 in Tokyo, actually that's quite doable if you're working within the British international system. And then the global reputation of the British education brand. So that's based in part on recognition of big name schools and universities, but it continues to be a strong brand globally. And that's something that appeals to parents and students.
Wonderful, thank you. Turning to you now, David. A-levels, they're thought of as the gold standard qualification across the world. And as of 2019, they were still the main entry route for students to UK universities. Is that still the case post-Brexit and the pandemic?
I think it definitely is, and as has been alluded to, they are an extraordinarily flexible curriculum where you can combine different subject areas. Students can build their portfolio in different kind of ways, be it a medic or an engineer or an artist or a linguist. The flexibility is there. And given the sheer scope of the number of students studying the British pattern curriculum, being at purely A-levels, GCSEs, throwing in a BTEC or nationals or technicals, all these kind of things, that universities the world over do their very best to recognise them, sometimes in the face of some quite obtrusive government policies. But it creates so many different options for students to really prepare themselves for the university and the subject that they wish to pursue once they decide to leave a school.
Yeah, and Brexit has obviously had a huge impact on the UK and on international students' entry to the country since the withdrawal agreement. So putting COVID concerns aside, is it now an impossible dream for international students to study at a top UK university?
Yeah, well, as a sort of former historian and history teacher, it's one of these ones where what's believed to be true might be more important than what's actually true. And education as a sector is one that tended to lean a certain way on Brexit, both voting for or against it and whether it's a good or a bad thing. And I think we've got a slight echo chamber mentality, possibly, but we have tended to see it as a bad thing rather than just focusing on the reality. If you look at the statistics, now we're in this first year group applying post the full completion of Brexit. There are certain parts of the world, particularly Central and Eastern Europe and places like Cyprus, where there was a huge throughput from schools to UK universities with a reliance on either free fees in Scotland or access to the tuition fee loan. Brexit hasn't changed anything for people outside the EU or the EA, hasn't changed anything for Ireland. And actually, when you look at the numbers, yes, there has been decline across the European Economic Area, apart from Ireland. The decline has been more in Central and Eastern Europe than it has been in Western Europe. It has been greater for courses that are not seen as high demand ones. It has been greater in the less well regarded universities. But for Oxford, Cambridge, medicine, dentistry, vets, there's less of a decline. And actually, if you look outside the EU, demand is up. More students have applied to UK universities in every single year since Brexit than ever before. And actually, may have seen the attendees joining us or their university advisors at schools, a really good article over the weekend in The Guardian. We're facing capacity issues in the UK. The issue isn't we don't have enough students. The issue is potentially we have too many students. So I say it's not necessarily thinking that Brexit is a bad thing. If you look at the data, whether it's Brexit, pandemic, or the new graduate visa, more students want to come to the UK than ever before.
Brilliant. And we are, I think it's important to say, we are very welcoming of all of those students still coming to the UK. So that's great. Nicola, let's look at one of the key tenets of the British curriculum, the rigorous and respected assessment approach. It's the topic at the forefront of everybody's minds right now. And whilst we're not going to go into detail about this year's approach, it is important we address it. The exam series here this year and last year were significantly impacted by COVID and the resulting assessment arrangements, particularly last year with CAGS and the ill-fated algorithm, which have led some educators to question whether the British curriculum's assessment approach is broken forever. Is it?
Well, blunt question, blunt answer from me. I think the short answer is no. So there's lots and lots of things have been derailed by the pandemic, and we could absolutely talk for hours about how we feel about the alternative arrangements that have been put in place. But that doesn't mean that the fundamental approach of the British curriculum is broken. And in fact, while it might not be how we wanted to confirm this, the pandemic has really helped to highlight the importance of the recognition of the British qualifications that David talked about and the trust that's placed in their processes, regardless of the specific assessment approach. And also the demand for external objective assessment wherever possible, which is a really key principle of the British curriculum. And the feedback that we've been receiving over and over and over again from all of our international schools, and I think Fiona mentioned it earlier as well, is that the rigor of the British qualifications is a really crucial aspect of this curriculum that students, parents, international schools, governments, higher education institutions and employers really respect and value. And that is what underpins the integrity of the British curriculum and its qualifications overall. So I think it's really important to remember that when we think about the curriculum and its qualifications, that it's not a single given piece that makes up that value. It's the sum of its parts and the respect and trust that it has, and then the progression that it offers to students. And I think this kind of opens the question up around reform. There's lots of discussion everywhere about reform and what have we learned about, education and assessment throughout the pandemic. and what this will mean for all of us in the future. And there's no question that the pandemic has changed global education. So we're already seeing significant changes in online schooling, digital services for students and schools. Whether that's temporary or permanent remains to be seen. And I think each school may, choose different options depending on what suits them best. But I think these are kind of the starting point of how innovation, which has now perhaps been accelerated by necessity, but how that's going to transform the overall education world in the coming years. So whether it comes under the headline of reform or not, I think it's really important that we all learn from the last 15 months now, that we adapt, we adopt the good stuff that we've learned, we address the less good things that we've learned don't work well, either in general or especially during a pandemic. And that we continue to evolve, but that doesn't mean starting from scratch. That doesn't mean, oh, this hasn't worked, therefore, let's start again, throw the baby out with the bathwater. For me, I think it means taking what we've learned from the pandemic and in general, and blending them with what we know is important about the British curriculum. So the rigor that Fiona mentioned, the breadth of the curriculum, the flexibility of the curriculum that David talked about, that external objective assessment, the skills development that's woven through the curriculum as well, and the integrity and the recognition of the qualifications, and making sure that we take all of this and our new learnings to continue to offer the best possible educational experience and outcomes for our students. So the original question, back to that, the answer is no, I don't think it's broken. I think the underlying approach and the principles are actually more important than ever.
Wonderful. Thank you, Nicola. That's a really interesting take. Turning to you, Fiona, lots of schools have reported increased engagement amongst parents since the pandemic, with some parents questioning school leaders about the curriculum they follow and why they've chosen that pathway. So given everything that's happened in the last year with COVID, Brexit, assessments, and families staying in country rather than travelling for work and education, how can school leaders here today reassure parents and prospective families of the enduring value of a British education? Obviously, we've talked to some points there, but what would you say would be the key points to reassure parents and prospective families?
Well, I think a lot of the reasons that we've already discussed about the sort of popularity of the British education brand, they still apply. The breadth of the curriculum, the high standards of pastoral care, an emphasis on safeguarding, extracurricular recognition, transferability of qualifications. But I actually think at its heart, it's about what's going on in the schools. So it's not about, a particular curriculum choice, although, that's part and parcel of a British international school. But I think British international schools and all sorts of schools have really demonstrated their strengths over the past 18 months. They moved to remote provision so quickly and so well, providing really tremendous support for their school communities while continuing to prioritize high quality teaching and learning and people welfare. These are schools they're committed to ensuring the best possible outcomes for their pupils, and they've really worked tirelessly. I have so much respect for these schools. They've worked tirelessly to achieve this over the past 18 months. And I think it's actually that commitment which is a great source of reassurance for both current parents and prospective families. And I think a lot of families have been much more involved and have a much better grasp of what that teaching and learning looks like in schools than they maybe did before the pandemic.
Yeah, I agree entirely. There's a comment in the chat here from Matthew Williams saying, one could argue that British education is more successful internationally than it is in the UK, especially in the state sector. And I think that point, we could argue that all day, couldn't we? But the point that you make about how quickly and effectively international schools pivoted in the pandemic towards teaching and learning online really was quite incredible. And last week at the COBIS conference, there was so much chat about that, so much exchanging of ideas about the apps and the programs and the platforms that international school leaders used and their teachers learnt from. And I think that is definitely one place where international schools have trumped the UK, certainly in the last 15 months. David, let's turn to you. So how would you reassure parents and prospective families that British qualifications are still valued and valuable?
Yeah, I think this is, again, this idea is sort of a misconception. I attended the COBIS Bursars conference a while back, and this was something a lot of sort of the people with a very commercial mindset were having about this was, well, we're the British school and it might be more, expensive for our families to go to the UK. Well, what does that mean? And that's sometimes the misconception that A-levels are only a route into UK universities. A-levels are taken all over the world, as everyone here can testify to, and there are a huge range of universities that accept them, be that private universities all over the US, which are able to do what they want to, and similarly in Europe, or public universities where there are agreements with state governments, with ministries of education, to allow all sorts of progression. There are clearly some glitches. Anyone who's dealing with A-level entry to Germany or Switzerland will be aware of some of the complexities of finding equivalencies to subjects there. If you're an EU school and your students are applying to Ireland, the CAO and the points scoring is sometimes a bone of contention. But broadly speaking, it's exactly the same process as you would be doing for a student heading to the UK. You need to have really good careers, information, advice and guidance for students choosing their sixth form pathways, with an awareness and clear lines of communication to the student and their parents as to what they are opening up and what they are closing off, not just in subjects, but in different countries, and strong messages within your community of staff, faculty, teachers, everybody involved in the school community, including admissions, as to what A-levels do. When I was an international school counsellor, could sometimes be really frustrated that we'd be giving all the messages out to the teachers and all this kind of stuff, and then someone in admissions or someone lower down the school would say, oh, I've heard it's hard to use A-levels to go to university in whatever country. It's not, it's all very possible, but it does just mean that you have to have some kind of framework, making that message really clear. In exactly the same way as a lot of people sometimes get, when I'm talking about studying in a university in the Netherlands or Belgium or France, go, but I don't speak the language. We forget to tell them that there are courses in English. We have to keep telling our communities that you can use A-levels and BTECs and other British curriculums to study in universities well beyond the UK.
Wonderful, thank you. Nicola, any additional insights before we move on to our next question?
Oh, well, I completely agree with everything that Fiona and David have said, so I won't repeat all of that. I think just in general, I think it's really important to help parents generally understand the benefits of any curriculum that you choose, in this case, the British curriculum, and how it might be different as well to their own experience or their own local curriculum. I think sometimes we assume things might be the case in an education setting based on our own experiences, and that the British curriculum may be quite different depending on where you are based as a school. So, for example, the international GCSEs and the international A-levels, providing that depth of study and the subject knowledge required for entry to university, but also that they help students develop the transferable skills that they'll need for employability in the future, and that being a really key aspect of those qualifications that isn't necessarily fully understood as a benefit by many parents. And just on a practical level, because I am part of Pearson, but I really encourage you to take a look at the guide for parents that we have. I think maybe, Susie, if you've got the link, to drop it into the chat. Yeah. It's a really simple, great document that I think is a great starting point for conversations with parents about British curriculum, and helps focus on the outcomes and the benefits for their children rather than getting initially bogged down into the detail of the how. So I think often we can focus on how we get there, but really first it's important for parents to understand those benefits for their children and get them excited about that before then moving on to, all of the details about how you get there. So
brilliant. Thank you, Nicola. I've dropped the link to the document that Nicola mentions into the chat. So yeah, do have a look at that. Not now, so I want you to concentrate on what we're saying, but afterwards. Right, we have we need to go to Q&A, so I'm gonna just wrap up with one question for each of you. So I'd like to ask you in turn: is a British curriculum still best? Or perhaps a better way of putting this is the growth in demand that we're seeing for a British curriculum still justified? I think I know how you're going to answer this, but let's hear your individual insights. David, let's start with you.
Yeah, I mean, I would be careful to say we're not bashing other curriculums, but we're also not cheerleading for one either. Mm-hmm. It can be best for the right students for the right school, but it's got to be based on a proper process of understanding what the sort of demographics of your student body are and where they want to go to. I think the pandemic, Brexit, visa changes, political changes all around the world have made it really important that schools kind of conduct proper audits on where are students coming from and where are they going to, both in terms of countries, but also in terms of subjects. Mm-hmm. And that will lead you to a discussion, not just of which curriculum you offer, but which options do you offer within the curriculum? You know, what English qualifications are you doing? Are you doing a literature, a language, first language, second language? What maths curriculums are you doing? Even within A-levels, you've got the choices. And so I think it's really important that, yes, the UK curriculum offers you more flexibility than almost anything else when you piece together all the different components of it. But I would really encourage everyone to do that piece of work and look at, is your variety of the curriculum really working for you? And look at those destinations that people are going to, because if things are changing, if they're looking at Ireland and Germany in a way maybe they didn't, that might steer you in a different direction. I know through the teams at Pearson and at Covis as well, you've got people involved who can start to talk to you about all those kind of different choices you're going to have to make.
Lovely, thank you. Fiona.
I'd echo what David has said, but the international schools sector, it's very large. We know it's growing steadily, and there's a really wide range of schools, and a lot of them are combining curricula, qualifications, orientations. These schools are increasingly catering for a really diverse range of pupils and families. And as David suggested, there's a need to adjust your provision based on the needs of your school community. But I think if what you're dealing with is families who are looking for ease of movement between schools or a clear route to UK universities, or a sort of holistic broad education, then the British international system, and particularly, here's my plug, but particularly schools like those in membership of Covis that have been through a really rigorous quality assurance process, that's going to be a good option.
Lovely, thank you. And Nicola.
Yeah, I think it would be really arrogant of me to say that, or even to think that British is best. So I won't, and I don't. I genuinely don't even think it's about British. That's kind of just a descriptor of origin. It's, if you will, a brand. And we say British curriculum and British qualifications, but it's really about the knowledge and the skills that these qualifications equip students with, and the doors that these qualifications open. And in my day-to-day working life, I don't refer to, it's rare that I would call the qualifications that I look after British qualifications. So we call them international qualifications, and that works much better for me. And it ties into, what David was saying about progression to universities around the world. And that then becomes a descriptor, not of origin, but of the future of that student's progression. And links to the concept of the passport that these qualifications offer. So unfortunately, once again, my answer is going to be no, Susie. I don't think that British is best, but I think what really is best is an education that is best suited for your students and equips them with the knowledge and the skills that they need to be successful in further education and future employment as well.
Wonderful, thank you. Right, we have got 9 minutes left of this webinar. So in the spirit of hosting it like an effective panelist and host, I'm going to turn to some questions. Now, we had a couple of pre-submitted questions, which I will start with those if I may. If you have any questions that have occurred to you or you'd like to ask our panelists specifically about, please do put those into the Q&A box. And then after we've answered these couple of questions, which I think will be of interest to lots of you here today, we will get through as many of those as we can. So the first question that was submitted to us in advance is from Dr. Mary Asian, Principal of Ghana International School in Accra, and she asks, we are increasingly getting questions about why we don't switch to the IB. Parents think it is more global ready for their children. In what ways does a British style education supersede the IB? Nicola, any thoughts on that one?
Yeah, I'm really interested in how that question is phrased, and it makes me think about what I was just saying about the British qualifications versus international qualifications. And the descriptor itself seems to be perpetuating that perception that British qualifications are only for the progression to British universities and employment. So that's really interesting, and perhaps something we should think about as a kind of a branding exercise. So yeah, good good question there, just in terms of the question phrasing. I think to the actual query though, the difference between the IB and the diploma program and the international A levels is the choice between a generalist versus a specialist education in the last 2 years of school. And some students thrive under each approach. So I imagine it's really difficult for schools to choose just one system or the other. And it's not to say that one is better, it is kind of figuring out what will work best for your students. And a lot of IB NYP schools have their students do international GCSEs first before moving on to the diploma, so that those students have the experience of sitting high stakes exams and gathering internationally recognized qualifications before they then move on to the diploma program. So I think in some ways now, though, they're less kind of directly opposed than they used to be. We've done quite a large review of our international qualifications in recent history, leading to our current international GCSEs and international A levels. And we did, that research threw up a whole range of findings of worldwide educational best practices, which we've integrated into these qualifications. So they are now more holistic and less purely content focused than their predecessors, and have a much greater outcome focus on the outcomes and the transferable skills that students will have at the end. So overall, those qualifications are quite similar to the IB in that they equip the learners with both the knowledge and skills that they need to be successful at university and in employment. So I think, it's not about which is best, but which is most suitable, and what can you, choose to best meet the needs of your students.
Lovely, thank you. Right, we will take one more of the pre-submitted questions, and then I can see there are some questions coming into the Q&A. We've got 5 minutes left, so just quickly on this one. This one is from Graham Malcolm, who's Deputy Head of Nord Anglia International School in Dubai, who asks, are there really any truly viable alternatives to GCSEs and A levels should they become permanent casualties of the upheaval caused by the pandemic? Nicola, I think that one's for you again, quickly. Oh, Nicola's on mute. We'll come back to that one. Don't worry, Nicola. I've got a question in the Q&A for David. Let's just have a look where it's gone. Where has it disappeared to?
So I answered one by text.
Oh, you've
so
answered it.
It was a question asking about where you can find these documents, and saying you've got to look at the recognition statements in each country. I know that Pearson, I think the team at Pearson have been working on trying to collate a lot of information, but it's country by country. We have some general information. If you go to our website, theuniversityguides.com, and search in the search button for Italy or Germany or places, you'll find our blogs and do sometimes podcasts which try to talk about these kind of things. But it is generally accepted in most places. The only places where you might have glitches would be Germany or Switzerland, where you've got to have the right combination to get the equivalent of a maturat or an abitur. There are also potentially issues in timing. For example, some Scandinavian university systems require you to have your final school A-level results by the first week of July. A-levels come out, obviously, not on the first week of July, so you're forced into a gap year. Beyond that, it's actually not as complicated as you would think, but you do need to double check this stuff. And if you are new to this idea of people going to different countries, some of the acronyms that you mentioned, Susie, that I like to join, but COBIS is great, but also the COBIS is a sister organisation. The Council of International Schools has a university advising arm, and the International Association for College Admissions Counselling as well. So if you've got a university advisor who's new to this stuff, I'd suggest joining some of those organisations to get access to resources that they have.
Lovely, thanks, David. Right, Nicola, are you back with us?
Yes, sorry,
okay.
my unmuting stopped working. I love
right.
Zoom.
Don't worry.
So remind me of the question, Susie, sorry.
Yeah, it was Graham Malcolm, Deputy Head of Nord Anglia International School in Dubai, and he's asking, are there really any truly viable alternatives to GCSEs and A levels should they become permanent casualties of the upheaval caused by the pandemic?
Yeah, I mean, that's an ongoing question and discussion, and links a little bit what I was talking about earlier in the context of that overall reform. We've already started work. I hope, Graham, you've seen the consultation that we ran. I'm not sure if it's still running, about the future of assessment. And the feedback that we're seeing there, I'm hoping I can already share this, but overall we're seeing that qualifications really still matter, and that employers and obviously universities still value GCSEs and A levels. So the question that's kind of coming out of the pandemic is less about the qualifications themselves, but more about the resilience of the system to cope with situations like regional and national lockdowns, and how we address that with the exam process as we know it right now. So we know, and our feeling is very strongly that high stakes, objective, external assessment has its place. It provides a motivation and goals for learning, and also provides that benchmark and recognition of that learning for individual students. But the pandemic has also brought the innovation that I mentioned earlier, and an acceleration of digitizing various aspects of life outside of education as well. I mean, doctor's appointments are happening digitally now. All these things that previously were impossible are now impossible. We're working remotely at scale, and have been doing so for 15 months at Pearson. So, it seems to work. And education is no different there. And I imagine that assessment will likely follow suit on that. So it provides opportunities to look at our qualifications and assessment system and refine it, rather than, like I said earlier, throwing the baby out with the bathwater and starting afresh. So I think it really is looking at what we've learned, and addressing those challenges that we're now ever more aware of.
Lovely, thank you. Right, I'm aware we're approaching time. There is one very quick question that I'm going to throw. I think I'm going to throw this one to David for 30 seconds. Do you think there will be a growth of British language university courses in Europe given Brexit? And this is from Mike Henderson.
I mean, the growth has been going on for many, many years, even before Brexit. I mean, you've got to forget that the UK is not the only English-speaking country in Europe. So, I've mentioned Ireland a few times, but don't forget that they've had a big growth this year in applications from the EU for places like Cyprus and Malta. But the Netherlands is, to all intents and purposes, an English-speaking country, as is Flanders, and all over Europe. The courses tend to be in a certain area, the more popular subjects, but it's a hugely developing sector. And when we see growth in places like Romania and Bulgaria and the Czech Republic and Hungary, we know this is spreading. So the growth it has happened and will continue to happen.
Wonderful. I'm sorry we're not going to be able to get to any more questions today, but thank you to those of you who submitted them. And those of you, if you're on the call, who submitted questions via email, we will respond to those questions via email for you. So all it remains for me to say is thank you, Fiona, David and Nicola, and to everyone who's joined us here today. Certificates of attendance and a link to the recording of this webinar will be sent to you by email. And I will just give a quick plug for the next Big Think webinar in our series, which takes place on the 10th of June. Nicola has talked about transferable skills, but the rest of the panel have alluded to them. We'll be discussing some more detail around the future skills that learners need to succeed at different ages and stages in that webinar, and asking what those dynamics mean for education. So if you'd like to join us for that one, please do register. Registration is open now on the Big Think webpage, which I believe is shared. Yes, it is. It's shared in the slide that you can see on your screens now. I do hope you can join us for that one. So thank you everybody for joining. Thank you panelists, and I hope this discussion was useful for you all. And thank you again, and have a great rest of the week.
Thanks everyone. Thanks, Susie.
Bye everyone. Bye.
Bye.